Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Mangs, and today I welcome you guys to a special Fire Emblem video that I wanted to do for quite some time now. In this video, we will be going through the Fire Emblem games and take a look at their history of sales. The purpose is simply just to have a look at the history of the franchise, see what games sold well and what games did not sell so well. And sometimes I will give my personal input and analysis for why I think this was the case. It is worth noticing that high sales does not necessarily equate to a good game. It could very well have other implications, such as marketing and the console's popularity. What I'm going to say in this video isn't anything revolutionary. All of these numbers are easy to find online, but I've yet to see a video on YouTube that compiles everything neatly together, and I think some people will enjoy watching this. I also feel like this video is a good way to educate certain fans that often like to bring up what games sold well and not so well during discussions. Sometimes I feel like a lot of people don't actually know the true numbers. As with any sensible video dealing in facts, I will of course link my sources in the video description, so let's get going! It all started with Fire Emblem I: Dark Dragon and the Sword of Light, which was released on the 20th of April 1990 on the NES. The game sold over 329,000 copies in Japan and was never released in the West. Fire Emblem I introduced many mechanics that at the time was quite revolutionary, as it combined RPG elements with turn-based strategy, something very few games had done before it. Was it successful? I dare say so. Of course, when you compare it to other giants of its time, such as Super Mario Bros. 3, which sold 18 million copies worldwide, it looks a little bleak in comparison. However, even though it did not blow the roof off in terms of sales, Fire Emblem I was by no means a flop, and this inspired the developers to keep evolving the franchise. Then came along Fire Emblem Gaiden. 2 years after the release of the first game, it came out in stores on the 14th of March 1992, and it was the last Fire Emblem game to be released on the NES. And again, this game was released exclusively in Japan. Gaiden did not revolutionize the franchise, nor did it kill it. It sold nearly as well as the first one, at 325,000 copies, although it is said that sales started off extremely slow and then spiked up at a later point. This could be due to poor marketing from Nintendo, but this happened so long ago it is difficult to get any reliable sources on what actually happened. The first Fire Emblem game to be released on the SNES was Fire Emblem III: Mystery of the Emblem, and it was released on January the 21st, 1994. This game sold exceptionally well at 700,000 copies, up 46% from Fire Emblem Gaiden. This probably stemmed from the popularity of the SNES, as well as limited competition at the time in terms of turn-based strategy games. This game was of course a remake of the first one, but it was so polished and well updated that I don't think many people viewed this as a problem. Many credit Fire Emblem III as the game that solidified the franchise, as it is to this day the best-selling Fire Emblem game to be only released in Japan. Two years later, on May the 14th, 1996, Fire Emblem IV: Genealogy of the Holy War was released on the SNES. The series gained quite a bit of complexity in comparison to its predecessors, including a vast array of features never before seen in a Fire Emblem game, and for some reason the sales dropped quite a bit, only selling 580,000 copies in Japan. That's almost 20% lower compared to Fire Emblem III. Now, many speculate that Fire Emblem III was simply an anomaly in terms of sales, and Fire Emblem IV definitely did not do poorly by any means, nor can we be certain that the new features alienated fans of the series, and thus made it sell more poorly. But compared to Fire Emblem III's success, Genealogy of the Holy War was definitely a step down in the sales departments. On September 1st, 1999, we saw the last Fire Emblem game to come out on the SNES, Fire Emblem V: Trisha 776. This was the last Fire Emblem game to be developed by Shozu Kaga, the original creator of the first game and viewed by many as the father of Fire Emblem. Trisha 776 did not do well at all, selling only 260,000 copies in Japan, and Kaga left the company shortly after its release. One has to ask if the poor sales had something to do with his departure. Trisha 776 is known to be one of the most unfairly punishing games in the series, not due to enemies having high stats or difficult map objectives, but because it really threw a lot of new, bothersome mechanics in the face of players, such as the introduction of fatigue, fog of war, and capturing. One has to ask if the new mechanics simply turned fans away from the series, though many speculate that the golden age of the SNES was simply over, and that other, more popular consoles, such as the N64, which came out 2 years prior to Trisha 776's launch, simply outclassed it. On the 29th of March 2002, Fire Emblem made its transition to handheld console. Fire Emblem VI Binding Blade was released on the Game Boy Advance and sold 390,000 copies in Japan. That's up 66% compared to Trisha 776. Fire Emblem VI went back to the roots and basic principles of the first games, scrapping a lot of the mechanics added in the later ones. Again, however, it was sadly not released in the West, as the designers felt the game was too difficult for the Western audience. But something happened to spark the Western interest regardless, and that was the inclusion of Roy and Marth in Super Smash Bros. This move was about to change the history of the franchise forever. Finally, at long last, 13 years after the first game, we saw the first Fire Emblem game to ever be released in the West. Fire Emblem VII Blazing Sword was released in Japan on the 25th of April 2003. On the 3rd of November later that year, it reached the shelves of North America, and on the 16th of July 2004, it was available in Europe. Combined, Fire Emblem VII sold 970,000 copies worldwide, up 248% from its Japanese predecessor, and this game actually sold twice as many copies in North America compared to Japan, which I think shocked a lot of people. To date, this was the most successful Fire Emblem game so far in terms of sales, and we can most likely credit Blazing Sword's success for future releases in the West. On May the 14th, 2004, 1 year after the great success that was Fire Emblem VII, Fire Emblem VIII The Sacred Stones arrived, again also in the West. Considering the Game Boy Advance was on its way down in terms of popularity, many people found it a little puzzling that this game wasn't released on a newer console, but nevertheless it sold pretty well at 890,000 copies, only 9% down compared to the last one. Again, it was at its most popular in North America, selling 420,000 copies as opposed to only 300,000 in Japan. The franchise's decline in Japanese popularity probably stemmed from the game's difficulty, which was greatly reduced compared to previous installments of the game, and this probably turned many Japanese gamers away from the franchise, viewing it as being dumbed down for Western minds. On April the 20th, 2005, Fire Emblem made the transition from handheld back to console once again, as Fire Emblem IX Path of Radiance was released on the Nintendo GameCube. Even though Path of Radiance was once again pretty successful outside of Japan, it only sold 540,000 copies worldwide, down 40% from the previous games. This was in many people's eyes the first great failure of the franchise, considering sales had never been this low for a game released outside of Japan. Many blame the low sales on the change in graphics and style, probably alienating longtime fans of the series with its semi-realistic art style that was a steep contrast compared to the simple but elegant graphics of the earlier installments. Nearly 2 years later, Fire Emblem X Radiant Dawn was released on the 22nd of February 2007, this time on the Wii. Radiant Dawn sadly did not do much better and only sold 510,000 copies worldwide, down 6% from its predecessor. The biggest fall in popularity was without a doubt in Europe, where only a measly 30,000 copies were sold, and many consider this as yet another massive failure for the franchise. On the 7th of August 2008, Fire Emblem once again made another transition from console back to handheld, this time with Fire Emblem XI Shadow Dragon, released on the Nintendo DS, which was a second remake of the first game. This game received a lot of flack from the community due to its failure to include many key mechanics that had been present in earlier releases, and for many it felt as if the game regressed back to the Dark Age. Still, Shadow Dragon sold 640,000 copies worldwide, up 25% compared to Radiant Dawn, so if anything, Shadow Dragon brought the popularity up somewhat, albeit only slightly, and certainly nowhere near as much as it needed to. As a result, this game was the first one to put the Fire Emblem franchise in jeopardy, because after its release, Fire Emblem would go back to being Japan exclusive, which upset a lot of Western fans. And then we come to perhaps the darkest chapter in the history of the franchise. Fire Emblem XII New Mystery of the Emblem was released on July the 15th, 2010, again on the Nintendo DS, and it was a remake of the second book of Fire Emblem III. Due to Shadow Dragon's failure to captivate the West, Fire Emblem XII was released exclusively in Japan. They probably expected sales to be lower due to this, but they probably did not expect it to only sell a measly 270,000 copies, down 57% compared to Shadow Dragon, making Fire Emblem XII the second worst selling Fire Emblem game of all time after Trisha 776. This is, in my opinion, a great shame, as Fire Emblem XII actually took a lot of the criticism Shadow Dragon received and included a ton of features that made the game a lot more enjoyable to play. I dare say that if this game was released in the West, it would have sold a lot better than Shadow Dragon, but I guess we will never know for sure. For 2 heart-grueling years following Fire Emblem XII's release, the Fire Emblem community lived in fear of the franchise being dead and forgotten, until a ray of hope was seen on the horizon. And then the so-called savior of the franchise arrived. On April 19th, 2012, Fire Emblem Awakening arrived on the 3DS and took the world by storm, selling a combined 1.9 million copies worldwide. That is over a 700% increase compared to the last installments. While Awakening has certainly gotten a lot of flack from the community for poor writing and map design, it was undoubtedly a massive success in terms of sales, and definitely pushed a dying franchise back into the spotlights. And then we come to the present and newest Fire Emblem game at the time of making this video, Fire Emblem Fates. On the 25th of June 2015, Fates was released on the 3DS, and at the time of making this video, it has sold 1.3 million copies in Japan and North America alone, and that's before it has even gotten released in Europe. Considering Awakening sold around 430,000 copies in Europe, we can probably expect sales of Fates to rival or even surpass that of Awakening in time. It will be very interesting to see. Regardless if you like the new Fire Emblem games or not, it is very good as a fan of the franchise to see that we are entering a golden age of sorts in terms of sales, and this pretty much guarantees we will see future installments of Fire Emblem down the line. So that was a brief outlook at the sales history of the franchise. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Please consider leaving a like and a comment if you found this video entertaining, and if you want to see more Fire Emblem related content, hit the subscribe button. At any rate, my name is Mangs, and I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.